Welcome to my psychology channel. This video may feel long, but if you stay until the end, you may begin to understand why human behavior breaks down exactly at the moment it matters most. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Rational Behavior. We constantly build our entire existence upon one massive and comforting illusion, which is the unshakable belief that we are fundamentally rational creatures. In the calm moments of our daily lives, we navigate complex career plans and calculate financial investments with precise logic. We walk through the world draped in a thick armor of reason, confident that our advanced intellect guides every single choice we make. Yet, why do intelligent people lose control at critical moments? When we suddenly face high-risk situations, sharp disagreements, or surging emotional storms, this fragile disguise of rationality instantly disintegrates. Within a single second, a highly educated and sophisticated adult can regress into a purely instinctual creature driven entirely by blind defense and vicious retaliation. We become total strangers to ourselves exactly when wisdom is needed most. The trajectory of your career, the survival of your marriage, and the quality of your life are rarely determined by grand, carefully planned decisions. Instead, they are forged during those few crucial minutes of high-stakes conversation. During these intense interactions, language ceases to be a simple tool for information exchange. It instantly transforms into a lethal weapon for attack or a heavy shield for psychological self-preservation. We often mistakenly blame these behavioral breakdowns on a lack of emotional intelligence or poor communication skills. However, we completely ignore the dark and ancient psychological mechanisms silently hijacking our bodies. We believe we are engaging in an objective debate about facts, but beneath the surface, our deepest instincts are fighting a desperate battle to protect a highly vulnerable ego from total annihilation. When the brain perceives that psychological safety has been stripped away, even the most gentle advice can be warped into a malicious attack. In this vacuum of security, dialogue degrades into a zero-sum game of power, control, and survival. Rationality is not our default setting. It is merely a fragile illusion waiting to be shattered by the relentless and ancient tides of human emotion. The absolute conflict between ancient instinct and modern rationality remains the deepest tragedy of human interaction. Chapter 2. The Brain Under Threat. Have you ever wondered why your mind goes completely blank during a heated argument? To understand this phenomenon, we must first strip away the illusion of emotional intelligence and examine the cold, hard biology of the human brain. Our modern skull still houses an ancient, primitive nervous system designed for a wild and brutal world. We inherited a genetic bug that continually sabotages our most important relationships and professional ambitions. Millions of years ago, when our ancestors encountered a deadly saber-toothed tiger in the wilderness, this internal alarm system was an absolute lifesaver. But today, that exact same biological trigger is activated not by a physical predator, but by a critical look from your boss or a disappointed sigh from your partner. Your brain cannot tell the difference between a threat to your life and a threat to your ego. The moment a casual conversation escalates into a disagreement, two tiny organs above your kidneys frantically pump a massive flood of adrenaline directly into your bloodstream. This chemical hijacking instantly seizes complete control of your nervous system, launching a silent biological coup within your body. You are no longer the master of your own mind. You are simply a chemical puppet reacting blindly to the deepest fears encoded in your DNA. To prepare your body for physical combat or desperate escape, your internal system makes a ruthlessly efficient yet socially disastrous decision. It immediately drains precious blood and oxygen away from your prefrontal cortex, the highly evolved area responsible for logic, empathy, and rational calculation. That vital energy is diverted straight to your arms and legs. Physiologically, your intellectual capacity plummets to the level of a terrified wild animal trapped in a corner. In this severely depleted cognitive state, you are completely incapable of executing sophisticated communication strategies. Your behavioral menu shrinks violently down to just two primal options, which are fight or flight. When we choose to fight, we resort to verbal violence, utilizing absolute terms like always and never to dominate the space. We attack, we label, and we attempt to crush the other person to alleviate our own suffocating internal anxiety. Conversely, when we choose to flee, we adopt the cowardly disguise of silence. We withdraw from the interaction, masking our true feelings behind sarcasm or passive aggression. We might physically leave the room or emotionally shut down, punishing the other person with an icy, impenetrable wall of indifference. Both violence and silence are desperate attempts to reclaim control, yet both inevitably destroy the very connection we secretly wish to preserve. Imagine a husband returning home late once again, triggering a crucial conversation with his neglected wife. Instead of expressing her genuine need for connection, her hijacked brain chooses sarcastic violence, mocking his commitment to the family. This verbal attack instantly triggers the husband's own defense mechanism, pushing him further into silence and resentment. They become locked in a devastating downward spiral, perpetually wounding each other because their biology mandates pure survival. Is conflict really about the other person, or is it about the chemical chaos devastating our own internal systems? We blindly blame our partners and colleagues for the destruction of our conversations, completely ignorant that the real enemy resides within our own neurobiology. We are hostages to our own evolutionary hardware, trapped in a modern society where reacting like a prehistoric hunter only guarantees the utter annihilation of our deepest interpersonal bonds. Our biological evolution has tragically betrayed our social needs, transforming every meaningful disagreement into a brutal physical battle for psychological survival. Chapter 3: The Hidden Story Machine. How do we actually generate emotions? We constantly harbor the deeply flawed illusion that other people are directly responsible for our internal feelings. We firmly believe that their harsh words or cold glances directly cause our psychological suffering, yet behavioral psychology reveals a terrifying truth. Between the objective reality of what happens and the subjective emotion you experience, there exists a hidden story machine operating at lightning speed within your own mind. This invisible mechanism follows a strict cognitive chain that dictates our entire existence. First, we observe a raw fact, such as a manager walking past our desk without saying hello. Second, our brain frantically invents a story to interpret that silence, deciding that the manager is deliberately devaluing our hard work. Third, this fabricated story instantly triggers a surging wave of anxiety and resentment. Finally, driven by this manufactured emotion, we execute a destructive behavior. We almost never realize that we are the sole authors of our own emotional torment. The brain is biologically hardwired to seek certainty in an uncertain world, preferring a negative story over no story at all. To justify our own defensive reactions, we automatically construct 3 specific types of toxic narratives. These cognitive biases serve as psychological shields, protecting our fragile egos while simultaneously destroying our capacity for genuine human connection. The first cognitive trap is the victim mentality. Whenever we feel threatened, we instinctively rewrite the narrative to ensure we remain absolutely innocent and flawless. We whisper to ourselves that it is not our fault, painting our own behavior as the noble suffering of a misunderstood martyr. By completely denying our own complicity in the conflict, we relinquish our power to change the situation, choosing psychological comfort over the brutal honesty required for true resolution. The second destructive narrative is the villain mentality. To justify our own cruelty and verbal violence, we must first dehumanize the other person. We erase their complex human nuances and reduce them to a cartoonish monster, motivated entirely by pure malice. We tell ourselves that you are the problem. Once we slap the label of villain onto a colleague or a spouse, unleashing our darkest instincts upon them feels entirely justified and righteous. The third psychological shield is the helpless mentality. When the prospect of engaging in a crucial conversation feels too terrifying, we convince ourselves that absolutely nothing can be changed. We argue that the other person is simply incapable of listening, or that the corporate system is too corrupt to navigate. This cultivated helplessness is a brilliant disguise for cowardice. It provides the perfect intellectual excuse to escape the agonizing vulnerability of honest dialogue. So long as we remain blind to this internal narrative machine, we will forever remain prisoners of our own subjective illusions. Emotion vs reality becomes a brutal war we fight entirely inside our own skulls. We destroy marriages and shatter professional careers, not because of what actually transpired, but because of the horrifying fictions we quietly authored. Is conflict really about others, or about the stories we tell ourselves? The ultimate tragedy of human conflict is that we spend our entire lives bleeding from wounds inflicted entirely by our own imagination. Chapter 4: How Motives Become Corrupted. We always enter crucial conversations believing our intentions remain pure and constructive. We genuinely desire to resolve persistent conflicts with partners or clarify misunderstandings with bosses. Yet, when we encounter unexpected resistance or detect faint criticism, a terrifying psychological mutation occurs deep within our mind. Our original noble purpose is instantly erased, violently hijacked by the primal urge to protect our fragile ego from any perceived humiliation. The first corrupted motive that unconsciously takes over is the desperate need to win. A healthy dialogue should operate as a collaborative search for truth. However, under sudden psychological threat, it violently degrades into a brutal competitive sport. We stop listening to empathize and begin listening only to reload our verbal ammunition. We obsessively gather evidence to prove superiority, blindly destroying the relationship simply to feed our ego. When winning a debate fails to soothe the wounded pride, the corrupted motive sinks deeper into the dark desire to punish. We deliberately weaponize intimate knowledge against the other person, striking where it will inflict maximum psychological pain. Our brain rapidly transforms from a problem solver into a vicious executioner. We secretly believe that causing them intense suffering will somehow validate our own unspoken feelings of profound emotional inadequacy. When emotional heat becomes overwhelming, our motivation warps into the desperate need to escape. We retreat into a cowardly shell of silence, falsely pretending we no longer care about the issue. We willingly sacrifice genuine relationship health merely to maintain a fake, superficial peace in the present moment. By burying our heads in the sand, we allow festering resentment to slowly rot the entire foundation of our deepest human connections. Control V's illusion operates as the central battlefield inside our minds. We believe we command the conversation when verbally dominating a subordinate or shutting out a spouse. Yet, true psychological reality demonstrates the exact opposite. When motives mutate into winning, punishing, or escaping, we have entirely lost inner control. We remain blindly driven by unconscious defenses, mistaking our total surrender to ancient instincts as a display of supreme personal power. How can we prevent these shifts from destroying our lives? Top communicators master intervening at the intention level before opening their mouths. They ask brutally honest questions to rapidly reactivate the rational brain. What do I really want for myself? What do I want for them? What is the ideal outcome for this relationship? These cognitive inquiries force the raging ego to instantly step down and willingly relinquish absolute control. By refocusing our distorted motives back toward mutual growth, we execute the most difficult psychological maneuver possible. We consciously prevent the ancient monkey brain from sabotaging our modern existence. The ultimate tragedy of human conflict is not a lack of vocabulary, but the silent and complete corruption of our noblest intentions by the dark shadow of primal insecurity. Chapter 5. The Psychology of Safety. We constantly operate under the fatal misconception that the actual topic of a conversation is what triggers a vicious argument. We wrongly assume that discussing sensitive financial issues or criticizing a struggling colleague inevitably leads to explosive retaliation. Yet, behavioral psychology reveals a profoundly different truth. Human beings rarely become defensive about what you are saying. They become violently defensive because they suddenly feel unsafe listening to you. When psychological safety evaporates, the deepest parts of our brain immediately assume the role of a desperate bodyguard. We are no longer processing the meaning of the words being spoken across the table. Instead, our neurological scanners are frantically searching for hidden agendas, malicious intentions, and subtle threats to our social status. In this state of total emotional lockdown, even a genuinely warm compliment will be paranoidally twisted into a sarcastic insult. The container of human dialogue is entirely supported by two invisible yet absolutely critical psychological pillars. The first essential pillar is shared purpose, which functions as the deep underlying foundation of trust. When the other person believes that you are working toward a mutual goal and truly care about their best interests, their defenses naturally relax. They must vividly see that you are navigating the exact same storm on the exact same boat. However, when shared purpose fractures, the entire dynamic degrades into a desperate battle for individual survival. If your partner suspects that your primary objective is merely to win the argument or force them into humiliating submission, every sentence you utter becomes a lethal weapon. Conflict transforms from a collaborative problem-solving exercise into a vicious gladiator match where only one fragile ego can emerge victorious and undamaged. The second invisible pillar is mutual respect, which operates exactly like oxygen within any human interaction. As long as respect is abundantly present, nobody ever notices it flowing through the room. But the absolute second respect is sucked out of the atmosphere. It becomes the only thing anyone can think about. A person gasping for psychological air cannot possibly engage in a rational discussion about abstract corporate strategies or daily household chores. Consider a highly competent employee receiving routine performance feedback from a well-intentioned boss. If the manager subtly rolls their eyes or employs a patronizing tone, the employee instantly perceives a devastating threat to their fundamental human dignity. Reaction vs. awareness dictates that the employee will blindly react to the disrespect rather than processing the constructive advice. They will either aggressively defend their work or retreat into resentful silence. This breakdown highlights the ultimate tragedy of so many intimate relationships and professional collaborations. We frantically attempt to force uncomfortable facts down the throat of someone who is currently choking from a severe lack of respect. We argue endlessly over the minor details of the content while completely ignoring the raging fire engulfing the conversational environment. We confuse the sickness with the symptoms, fighting superficial shadows while the house burns down. To master behavioral intelligence, you must develop a dual-processor mindset during every single high-stakes interaction. You must simultaneously track both the surface-level content and the invisible atmosphere of psychological safety. When you notice the faint warning signs of a colleague withdrawing or a spouse raising their voice, you must immediately stop discussing the disputed topic. You must patiently step back and urgently rebuild the broken container of safety. Only by restoring shared purpose and validating mutual respect can you disarm the primal defense mechanisms guarding the other person. You cannot logic your way past a terrified biological system operating in a state of absolute threat. Is conflict really about the external problem we are trying to solve, or is it a desperate cry for basic human validation? The ultimate power in any relationship lies not in dominating the conversation, but in becoming the master architect of a completely safe psychological space. Chapter 6. Speaking without triggering defense. We operate under a deeply ingrained and dangerous delusion about honesty. We falsely believe that being authentic means throwing our unfiltered emotional conclusions directly into the face of another human being. We disguise our destructive impulses as radical candor, claiming we are simply being direct and straightforward. Yet, behavioral psychology reveals that dropping a highly charged emotional judgment upon someone is not communication. It is a psychological declaration of war that instantly triggers their primal defenses. Consider the anatomy of a typical failed interaction between a husband and wife. When one partner exhaustedly shouts that the other completely neglects the family, they believe they are stating an absolute truth. However, the human brain does not process this statement as a logical data point. The listener's biological bodyguard instantly perceives a massive threat to their moral identity. Reaction V's awareness dictates that they will instantly stop listening and frantically begin assembling their defensive counterattack. To speak our deepest truths without triggering devastating defensiveness, we must systematically deconstruct how we form our thoughts. The master communicator never initiates a crucial conversation with a story or a judgment. Instead, they exclusively begin upon the utterly safe and solid ground of objective facts. A fact is stripped entirely of emotional venom. It is simply an observable event that a soulless video camera could flawlessly record without any subjective interpretation. Why are facts so psychologically powerful? Because facts fundamentally bypass the threat detection centers of the primitive brain. If you tell a subordinate that they arrived 20 minutes late to the last 3 meetings, you are presenting an undeniable reality that cannot be argued emotionally. Instinct V's rationality plays out here perfectly. Starting with facts prevents the other person's adrenaline from spiking, keeping their prefrontal cortex fully engaged and open to processing complex information. Only after establishing this completely safe foundation do we carefully introduce our subjective interpretation. This is where we must employ extreme psychological caution. We must share our fabricated story, but we must do so with profound humility and highly tentative language. We must strip away all arrogant certainty. Instead of declaring that a colleague is deliberately sabotaging our project, we softly suggest that we are beginning to wonder if there is a disconnect in our mutual priorities. This tentative phrasing acts as a crucial psychological buffer. It signals to the other person that we recognize our internal narrative might actually be fundamentally flawed. Control V's illusion operates beautifully here. By willingly surrendering the arrogant illusion of absolute certainty, we ironically gain massive influence over the direction of the dialogue. We transform the interaction from a brutal courtroom interrogation into a collaborative, open-ended investigation of the underlying truth. The final and most crucial step is to genuinely invite the other person to share their own opposing narrative. We must willingly hand over the conversational microphone and ask them to correct our inevitable blind spots. What are you seeing that I am completely missing? This sincere invitation proves that our underlying motive is not to win, punish, or dominate, but truly to understand. It cements the psychological safety required for profound and vulnerable human connection. By walking someone else slowly down our own mental path of observation and interpretation, we eradicate the terrifying shock of an emotional ambush. We allow them to see the exact same objective reality that triggered our underlying anxiety without demanding immediate submission. Is conflict really about clashing realities, or is it simply the tragic collision of unspoken, defensive assumptions? When we strip our language of arrogant accusation and anchor it exclusively in observable reality, we finally learn to speak the searing truth without ever becoming the enemy. Chapter 7. Listening as Behavioral Intelligence. We constantly harbor the arrogant illusion that persuasion is exclusively achieved through brilliant speech. We firmly believe that if we simply present the perfect logical argument, the other person will immediately surrender. Yet, when a human brain is operating under severe psychological threat, incoming words merely bounce off a bulletproof defensive wall. Behavioral psychology reveals that the ultimate instrument of human influence is never the dominating mouth, but the empathetic ear. Consider our automatic biological reaction. When a partner suddenly withdraws into icy silence or a colleague explodes with unjustified rage, our primitive hardware instantly demands retaliation, misinterpreting their emotional distress as a direct personal attack. However, masters of behavioral intelligence execute a radical cognitive shift during these volatile moments. They consciously suppress their own raging ego and replace instinctual anger with a state of intense, clinical curiosity. Why do intelligent people lose control at critical moments? Because we forget that unreasonable behavior is always a desperate cover for unspoken fear. To dismantle this defensive fortress, we must first deploy the power of sincere inquiry. We must gently ask them to unpack their internal narrative without any hint of judgment or interrogation. We simply invite them to safely pour their toxic thoughts into a shared psychological space. But what happens when their spoken words completely contradict their physical reality? A spouse might angrily slam a cabinet door while coldly declaring that absolutely nothing is wrong. Here, we must utilize the technique of emotional mirroring. We calmly reflect their observable behavior back to them, acknowledging the tension in their posture. Emotion vs. reality is reconciled when we safely validate the hidden pain they refuse to verbally admit. Once the psychological dam begins to break and their fragmented story spills out, we must resist the overwhelming urge to immediately argue or correct their flawed logic. Instead, we must deliberately paraphrase their core message using our own words. When a terrified human being hears their deepest grievance accurately and respectfully summarized by their perceived enemy, the biological threat level plummets. They finally experience the profound relief of being completely understood. In the most extreme cases of total psychological shutdown, when the other person absolutely refuses to speak, we must deploy the advanced tactic of priming. We must bravely guess the darkest, most uncharitable motive they secretly suspect us of holding and speak it aloud, exposing the shadow. By voluntarily naming the exact fear that paralyzes them, we instantly shatter their defensive armor and prove that the conversation is genuinely safe. We must fundamentally redefine what it means to hold power within a crucial conversation. Control vs. illusion dictates that dominating the airwaves with aggressive arguments is merely the cowardly illusion of control. True behavioral authority belongs to the individual who can regulate the psychological atmosphere. Is conflict really about defeating others or about our inability to listen past their primal pain? The highest expression of behavioral intelligence is the ability to listen so deeply that the other person biologically forgets how to be afraid. Chapter 8. Breaking the behavioral loop. We often fall into a highly deceptive psychological trap after successfully navigating a volatile interaction. When we finally achieve mutual understanding and the emotional tension evaporates, a massive rush of dopamine floods our biological systems. We experience the intoxicating relief of reconnection and forgiveness. Yet, this very biological reward mechanism tricks us into believing that the underlying problem has been permanently solved. We fatally confuse a temporary emotional catharsis with permanent structural and behavioral change. Consider a deeply moving family resolution or a highly collaborative corporate brainstorming session. Everyone nods in harmonious agreement, smiling and basking in the warmth of restored psychological safety. But as the weeks pass by, absolutely nothing alters in reality. The heartfelt promises evaporate into the wind. Why do intelligent people lose control at the critical moment of execution? Because we mistakenly assume that having a meaningful dialogue is the exact same psychological concept as making a concrete decision. We are biologically hardwired to protect the fragile peace we just fought so agonizingly hard to establish. Therefore, we unconsciously keep our final agreements vague and ambiguous to avoid any sudden resurgence of conflict. We use comforting, yet completely meaningless, plural pronouns, whispering that we should really do better or we need to communicate more often. Behavioral psychology identifies this phenomenon as the diffusion of responsibility. When we say we, the human brain instinctively translates it as not me. Control V's illusion becomes blindingly apparent during the crucial transition from spoken words to lived reality. We harbor the illusion of control simply because we successfully survived the discomfort of the conversation. However, without a rigid structural framework, the primal brain will always inevitably default back to its most ancient, energy-conserving habits. To break the self-destructive behavioral loop, we must violently sever the comfortable ambiguity that guarantees future resentment and endless repetition. To ensure our new understanding survives outside the safe bubble of dialogue, we must neurologically anchor our abstract intentions to cold, hard reality. Every single aspiration must be ruthlessly assigned to one specific individual, attached to one highly observable action, and bound by one unforgiving temporal deadline. A task lacking a specific time requirement is never a genuine commitment. It is merely a desperate psychological wish masquerading as a strategic plan. Furthermore, we must establish an inescapable mechanism for constant accountability. Accountability is not an expression of interpersonal mistrust or corporate micromanagement. It is a necessary psychological scaffolding designed to protect our best intentions. It prevents the heavy gravitational pull of human nature from dragging us back into the abyss of our old dysfunctions. Emotion vs. reality dictates that warm interpersonal feelings will never replace the brutal necessity of executing disciplined consequences. A brilliant conversation devoid of clear structural boundaries is merely a meaningless echo fading into the endless corridors of human self-deception. Chapter 9. From Reaction to Conscious Control. We have journeyed deeply through the ancient biological architecture of the human brain, systematically dismantling the illusions that sabotage our most important relationships. We now understand that when an argument erupts, we are not truly fighting over a specific issue or a perceived insult. We are battling the searing chemical chaos unleashed by our own threatened egos. We have witnessed how our minds frantically fabricate toxic narratives of victims and villains merely to justify our primal urge to dominate or retreat. This profound knowledge places a heavy psychological burden upon us. Once you truly comprehend the mechanisms of human behavior, you can no longer remain a passive victim of your own neurobiology. Ignorance is the perfect disguise for unconscious cruelty, but awareness strips away that shield completely. When you realize that emotion vs. reality is a constant war waged entirely inside your own skull, You must finally accept absolute responsibility for your own internal atmosphere. Why do intelligent people lose control at critical moments? Because they arrogantly believe that intelligence alone can overpower millions of years of evolutionary hardware. True behavioral mastery does not demand eradicating our ancient instincts. It demands building a searing, moment-by-moment consciousness that can observe the primal reaction without blindly surrendering to it. It is the agonizing, beautiful capacity to feel the surging adrenaline of anger, yet deliberately choose to speak with profound empathy and precise rationality. We must stop wasting our lives frantically attempting to control the impossible variables of other people's behavior. Control vs. illusion reminds us that the only territory we will ever truly master is the space between our own internal trigger and our subsequent response. In that microscopic gap exists our ultimate human freedom. Top communicators do not possess flawless personalities. They simply possess the relentless discipline to monitor their own psychological barometer before unleashing verbal destruction upon those they love. Conflict is not a disease to be cured or an enemy to be avoided at all costs. It is simply the inevitable friction that occurs when two complex, traumatized universes attempt to share the exact same physical and emotional space. When handled with sincere intent, mutual respect, and clinical curiosity, conflict transcends violence. It becomes the essential forge where trust is actually tempered and deeper human connection is permanently solidified. We spend so much of our precarious existence believing we are protecting ourselves by building massive defensive walls, never realizing that we are slowly suffocating in our own isolation. True psychological safety is not found in total agreement or the absolute absence of tension. It is found in the courageous certainty that we can safely speak our deepest, most agonizing truths to another human being and still remain valued, heard, and profoundly loved. Thank you for enduring this exhaustive descent into the machinery of human behavior. If this exploration challenged your understanding of yourself and your relationships, please like this video and subscribe to my psychology channel for more unfiltered dismantling of the human mind. If your emotions are not caused by reality, but by the story you tell yourself, then who is really in control of your life?